Our scripture reading this morning is from the book of Mark, chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" And when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. And as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man, dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee, where you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Standing on that holy ground, this morning we are continuing to look with Mark at the family album, and we're about ready to close that family album. This is the last Sunday we're going to be looking at a photo from that album. But we remember that Mark is sharing these photos with us because he believes these photos can help us to embrace the Christian life with confidence, with faith, and with joy. Will you pray with me? God of power and wonder, as we prepare to hear your word proclaimed, stretch our imaginations to sense the majesty and mystery of your living presence among us. Amen. On the last page of the family album that Mark has gathered together for us, there is a photograph of three women. They are not related by blood, but they are related by their devotion to the person of Jesus. This photograph is not the most flattering photograph in the album, because these women have been caught by the camera with a kind of dazed, deer in the headlights look in their eyes, because they find themselves standing in a cemetery before an empty tomb. I wonder if you caught the words that Mark used to describe the emotions that those women felt as they stood before that empty tomb. Did you hear those words? Alarm, terror, amazement. Alarm, terror, amazement. Nor are we to assume that these are emotions that they just experienced in passing. For Mark tells us in his account accompanying this photograph that the women were seized by those emotions, which is to say that they were taken prisoner by them. And no wonder, for there before that empty tomb they had encountered an angel who said to them, "You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. He isn't here. He has been raised." No wonder there was alarm and terror and amazement in their life, for they were encountering something that nobody that they knew had ever encountered before in their life. And I suppose what they felt was something like the preacher John Killinger tells about feeling when he received word of the death of his father. He was living in Tennessee at the time, and his father was living in Virginia in the family home. And he tells about the way in which he remembers that event. He says he remembers the telephone ringing and that choked up voice on the other end of the line saying, "Your father passed away this morning." He remembers, he says, the quick packing of the suitcases and making the long trip from Tennessee to Virginia in the company of his wife. He remembers arriving at the family home to the tears and the sorrow of other relatives who had already gathered there at the home. He said, "I can remember clearly the morning of the funeral at the church, and I remember the graveside service out at the windswept cemetery. I remember," he says vividly, "the dinner that the church offered for the family and what it meant to the family to have that time where the church had offered them a dinner together." He said, "We sat around half the day just telling stories that elicited both tears and laughter." He says after the dinner concluded, everybody else in the family went back to the family home, but he said, "I went back out to the cemetery to stand alongside my father's grave one last time. And he said, it is there that I came to understand exactly how these women in our text for this morning must have been feeling. For he says, nothing would have filled me with more terror or amazement than to find that grave empty and see an angel standing there where I had left my father earlier in the day." And so, Mark says, the women fled the tomb and said nothing to anybody because they were afraid. No wonder they were afraid. They had been confronted by an experience that denied any possibility of explanation or description. You know, it often happens to us that there are things that take place around us where the only appropriate response, and indeed the only possible response, is silence. These women were silent because they'd had this experience of something traumatic that could not be explained, that could not be described. And often when we have that kind of experience, one of the things that happens to us is that for a while we lose our ability to speak. We just don't have any words. And if we had them, they would not come. Often people who witness some kind of a traumatic event, say a murder or a hideous car wreck or something like that, find that in the immediate time afterwards they simply are not able, they just aren't able to speak. Oftentimes People who have that kind of experience enter into a kind of a trance-like state. And for a little while, they just are out of touch with reality. And for some time, they're just not able to speak. I read an interesting experience of a family not long ago, a family that was very close-knit, and they experienced the death of a beloved uncle. And there was in the family a little nephew who was about 8 years old. And after the funeral was over, that little 8-year-old boy stopped talking. And for more than a year, he did not speak a single word. And as you can imagine, the parents were completely distraught. They didn't know what to do. They took him to every doctor they could figure out to take him to. They took him to a psychiatrist. They took him to a neurologist. They took him to a speech therapist. But for more than a year, not a word came from that little boy's lips. And then one evening, his family was gathered around the dinner table, and all of a sudden he began to cry. And his mother and father rushed over to him and wrapped their arms around him, and he choked out through his tears the first words that he'd spoken since that funeral, and he said, "Nobody loved Uncle Hallie." And the parents said, "What do you mean? What do you mean nobody loved Uncle Hallie? We all loved him." He said, "Then why didn't anybody cry? Why didn't anybody cry at his funeral?" And the parents remembered that that the adults had all gotten together when this death occurred and had said to one another, "Now let's don't cry in front of the children." Do you see? Do you see? A traumatic death, stoic adults, no tears. And it was all too much for that little boy, and so he retreated in terror into the sanctuary of silence. And so, Mark says, the women fled from the tomb and did not say anything to anybody because they were afraid. And that is the way in which Mark ends his gospel. Not everybody liked the way Mark ended his gospel. It didn't seem right to some of them. It didn't jibe with the joyful report of the resurrection of Jesus in the other Gospels. All that terror and silence just didn't seem right. And so a few years later, some of the scribes who were charged with copying the manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark decided it had to be fixed. And so when you look at the ending of Mark today, in your Bible, you will either find a footnote or you will find some continuing text beyond the text that Esther read for us this morning called the longer ending of Mark. 10 verses were added to the original ending of Mark because somebody couldn't stand the silence and the fear. But Mark didn't feel that way, because Mark understood that any time you experience something like the resurrection, it is going to have both an element of terror and an element of hope. Both an element of terror and an element of amazement. And that is why Mark hopes that when we look at that final photo in his album, we will be inclined to flip back a few pages in the album to another picture that he has placed there in that album. Biblical scholars, some biblical scholars at least, believe that this is the way in which Mark tells the story of the resurrection in his gospel. It's a familiar passage to you, but you may not have thought of it as Mark telling the resurrection story. Listen, it took place right after the feeding of the 5,000, and Mark says immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. And after saying farewell to them, he went up the mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was out on the sea. And when he was alone on the land, he saw that they were straining at the oars in an adverse wind. And he came towards them early in the morning, walking on the sea. He intended to pass them by, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost. And they cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded. Did you hear in that passage some of the same words that Esther read for us in that text about the resurrection this morning? Alarm, terror, and amazement. The same words in both of the passages. And somehow, when I look at these two photos, when I hear these two texts filled with the same words, I am reminded of the way in which the poet Anne Weems describes the meaning of those two texts, the meaning of those words. She says, "When we approached Jerusalem, the crowd stood at the gates, and through voices choked with tears, they cried, 'In his dying, we are lost.' But the angels stood on the hill and sang, 'In his rising, we are found.' In his rising, we are found." Let us pray. Gracious God, do not let the final word in our lives be terror. Do not let our lives end in fear that keeps us silent. But let the word that describes our lives be forever hope. Amen.